Interested in.
Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Brandon Hines. I'm the director here at the Hayes Public Library. So glad you could join us for this event. We're here to talk about pollinators, wildflowers, and birds. And when we were setting this up, I had a staff member say, I don't get it. So that's the point of this evening. I'll introduce our biologists up here, and then our farmer, I guess, our fourth biologist and a farmer. And as it'll flow, we're going to start talking with the wildflowers, kind of big Western Kansas type talks, and then we're going to talk about the pollinators, followed by some specific projects at some wildlife areas, and then working with individual landowners all the way down to specific projects on a farm, on a working farm. So you'll see all that connection. My inspiration for this came from a chapbook that Humanities Kansas put out. And we have several copies of that back here. I know one of you are here just for this book of poetry, Pat. So $25 on your way out the door. No, it's free. I'll get in trouble if it's not. And I'm really excited that the director of Humanities Kansas, Julie Mulvihill, whom I've worked with for several years now, is able to join us. So she's going to talk briefly about Humanities Kansas and this chapbook project. Julie Mulvihill.
Thanks, Brandon. I am so excited to be here at Hayes tonight. I'm just absolutely delighted. And if you haven't had an opportunity to pick up a free copy of Wild Words, I hope you do. Because there's a couple of lines in some of the poetry that's found in here that I think might strike a chord. James Thomas Stevens in his poem writes, "The mind is the hardest crop to tend." Right? And then you can go on and read more about that. Or Janice Northern says in her poem, "How to Fall in Love," "When you look upon the plain's prickly pear, do you see flower or thorn?" So Wild Words is a project of Humanities Kansas. If you're unfamiliar with Humanities Kansas, we are an organization and we like to say we're leading a movement of ideas. Well, what does that mean? Well, we use history, literature, ideas, poetry to really talk about what it means to be human. What have we valued over time across generations? And for those of you who here in Hayes, you have a long and deep history with the land, with community, with your history. So we're happy to be here tonight. A few years ago, we did our very first chapbook. We wanted to think about how do we combine the environment, nature, with poetry. We felt that there was inspiration that could be found in both. So we did our very first book in 2021 called Words of a Feather, where we paired original Kansas poetry with backyard birds. And it was a huge hit. So we brought it back again, this time with Wild Words, that pairs original Kansas poetry about wildflowers here in the state, with illustrations to go along with it. And we hope you'll enjoy it and find the inspiration that you need. We partnered with 50 organizations around the state, just like Hayes Public Library, to be distribution sites. We distributed a couple of thousand of these books as people walked around in their backyards and hiked around on trails, reading poetry to one another, to themselves, and looking at the beautiful wildflowers that are popping up all over today. So we would like to inspire you to pick up this book, try something different. We've got an idea for our next chapbook, so Pat, wherever you are, we'll be looking for you in a couple of years, and hope that you enjoy and really appreciate the humanities and nature and the way that they can inspire us in different ways. So Brandon, I will give this back to you. I hope that's what you wanted.
Thank you, Julie. We do have a copy of Birds of a Feather downstairs in the Kansas room, so you can check that out. I think it's pretty hard to get your hands on it at this point, but we do have some copies in circulation. All right, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I'll start over here with Dr. Matt Galliard. Matt has been here since 2019, and he's an instructor of plant biology at the Fort Hays State Biological Sciences Department. His research centers around plant ecology, Prairie grasses utilizing ecology, evolution, and genomics to ultimately better understand how plants will respond to changing climates. Dr. Sarah Elsay is also with the Fort Hays State Biology Department. Her emphasis is on, or her expertise is on ecology and native bees, and she's been with the department just since the fall of 2022. She grew up in North Carolina, got her undergrad through the University of Wyoming, and her graduate through her doctorate through the Oklahoma State. We have, I jumped over here, Camden Sweet is with us. Camden grew up in Pratt, Kansas. He's a Pheasants Forever Farm Bill biologist. He went to Fort Hays State University and got his bachelor's degree in natural resources in the spring of 2020. He's worked some jobs with the Department of Wildlife and Parks, and you're actually in Osborne now in that area. And his job is a Farm Bill biologist, so he covers 9 counties for NRCS, and he does work on CRP and then wildlife habitat and plans in those areas. So he works directly with landowners and has a pretty broad region. Dalton Olivers from Smith Center, he is stationed out of Cedar Bluff, and he focuses on that wildlife area and a lot of the projects out there, reports to the Department of Wildlife and Parks, and he also has worked with the Department of Wildlife and Parks in the summertime, and he graduated with his degree from Fort Hays State University in what year? 2021. So, I appreciate all you guys being here, and Sarah. We're going to go ahead and start with the presentation for the materials or whatever Dr. Galliard wants to present here. He's focused more on the plants, the ecology of our area, and we'll start kind of general and work our way down to, I skipped Nathan. Nathan, he is not a biologist. I thought about starting with this: a librarian, a banker, walked into a bar, a bunch of biologists, but I got nothing. So Nathan Legleiters, he's from Hays. He's a banker. He's the vice president over at Golden Belt Bank over in Ellis. He has a 15-year tenure in ag lending. He was recently elected to the Smoky Hill chapter of Pheasants Forever, the president position, and he's been instrumental in setting all this up. There's some really cool swag that they brought in, and I'll have him talk about that in a little bit. So we got some really cool stuff from Nathan and the local Pheasants Forever group. So with that, we will go to Dr. Galliard, and I'll turn him loose on talking about the plants in our area.
Just do one pollinator and plant. Favorite pollinator and plant?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So have us start with that.
Yeah, go ahead. I challenge them to start with their favorite pollinator and their favorite plant. Explain why.
All right, so hello everybody. My name is Dr. Galliard. I've got 2 answers for this. Might catch some flack from this, but I think both answers are technically valid. Favorite pollinator, I would argue for me, would be wind. Favorite wildflower, big blue stem. It's a flowering plant, has a flower. That's what I work on professionally. That's most of my research is centered around that. But more towards, I guess, the scope of this event tonight. Favorite pollinator would have to be the monarch butterfly, just with memories of helping my mother, who was a school teacher, collect them from her butterfly bush and get them set up in her classroom. And favorite wildflower, I would say snow on the mountain, just because it's one of those ones that's beautiful that you see from afar, that nice white color, and you think those are all the flowers, and you look closer, and no, those are actually part of the leaves. They're the bracts that are surrounding these small, petite white flowers on that plant. And so I guess that gets that out of the way. And so there are some beautiful big bluestem flowers. You can see the nice yellow anther hanging out, the purplish stigma of the pistil hanging out there. Nice, pulling that up as we go. So what I was thinking about kind of starting us off with is just kind of setting the context, setting the stage of where we're at. So we're in Kansas, right? We're here smack dab in the middle of the Great Plains. And so we're in kind of prairie heartland, if you will. So if we think about these habitats and prairies across Kansas, do they all look the same? across the state? No, of course not. If you were to go on a nice 6-hour drive from western Kansas, the Colorado border, all the way to eastern Colorado, what might you notice as you drive along the I-70 corridor?
It's the ugliest route across Kansas.
It's the ugliest route?
It gets greener.
It gets greener. What else?
More trees.
More trees. It gets taller. We transition from, in western Kansas, kind of this short grass dominated area where we see buffalo grasses and blue grama. As we get into central Kansas, we get into the mixed grass prairie where we've got short grasses and tall grasses both coexisting. We still see those buffalo grasses, those gramas. We start to see big blue stem, little blue stem plants, grasses like that. As we get into eastern Kansas, we start to really get into the tall grass prairies where we've got big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, little blue stem dominating these areas. And so when we talk about prairies and these grasslands, usually that's the first thing we think about, grass. But in addition to the grasses, as hopefully we all know, that there are plenty of wildflowers, plenty of forbs and other woody species, providing kind of the home, the food sources for our pollinators. The one thing I want to maybe talk about and mention is, I forgot to put them out, but there's a bunch of good wildflower books of Kansas, field books, field guides of the flowers of Kansas. But one of the things, a lot of those that you'll notice, and when you go online to some of the resources, Native Plant Society, Kansas Wildflowers, it's almost in a Flint Hills context. That's where the thoughts are, and we have flowers here too. We have these things right in our backyard to really appreciate and be able to enjoy. And yeah, here it is. Got plenty of time? Yeah. Okay. So as we look across these landscapes, we see these differences, short to medium to tall. And if we think about historically, kind of these areas that we work within, does anybody know how much tallgrass prairie is remaining? Very little percent. I think usually the number is about 4%. What about mixed grass prairie? More, less? More. Yeah, about 20-25%. Shortgrass prairie, it's in the ballpark of 50. And so, we think about these natural habitats. Here in our back door, around here in Hays, Kansas, in Ellis County, we've got those natural fields. We've got those native populations of wildflowers that we can utilize, that we can enjoy, that we can see around us. And not to call anybody out, but getting back to the ugliest drive across Kansas. I mean, across Kansas, maybe, but I would argue that, there's nothing better than a native prairie to look at. Kansas is the flyover state. I'd argue not. I'd argue prairies are one of the best, kept secrets that we can share and share a passion for the plants, for the flowers, for the animals that call this piece of Kansas home. So I'll stop there.
I'm not as fly by the seat of my pants speaker as my coworker, so I made slides. Perhaps. Okay. Well, that video is supposed to be going, but that's okay. I'm Dr. Sarah Elze. I'm new to Hays. As of last year, I started as an assistant professor in biological sciences. I'm a landscape ecologist that happens to specialize in native bees. So I left my email up there. I'd love to chat if anyone has any questions about bees. wildflowers, I'll send to Matt. But mostly what we're doing in my lab is looking at how landscapes, so really broad ecological questions like both abiotic, so non-living, and the living factors on the landscape, like, heterogeneity or different types of grasses, different types of flowers affect native bees. So I've worked a lot with energy development, like wind energy and gas development, and how that affects bees, and agriculture. I'm also kind of dipping my toe into climate change, although that requires quite a bit of data, which just takes years. So we're all pretty familiar with the insect apocalypse, the Armageddon, the loss of insects. So there was a famous study that got picked up by media in 2017, came out of Germany. And basically the scientists drove with a big net on top of his car and kind of calculated what we all might experience, whereas your windshield is not covered with as many dead insects as it used to be. Maybe you've experienced that. But that was basically that study, how he kind of came up with the idea. And the paper was by Hallman et al. In 2017. And the results found that insect biomass decreased by something like 75% in only 27 years. So he had kind of, made a little bit of an estimate there, but we're really losing not only biodiversity, which we're all kind of aware of, but we're also losing just the biomass, which is the count of insects. So I am really interested in that, but specifically I'm interested in native bees. So you might have seen a picture like this. So this is our produce section with pollinators, and this would be our produce section without pollinators. And really the message here is we would start to lose about 1/3 of our food without pollinators if they were completely absent. And perhaps that wouldn't result in as much starvation issues, but really what we're looking at is a problem with micronutrients and human health, and that's kind of where we would see really significant impacts on people, but we would also see very significant impacts on our wildflowers and our prairies. And so I have to just spend just a wee moment differentiating between honeybees and native bees, because I have a lot of love for honeybees. This is everyone's favorite bee that makes honey. They live in really large numbers, but they are in fact not native to North America. They're really important for food production, honey production, but I will be spending the rest of my time talking about everything else. So you might be familiar with the big carpenter bees. Lots of people don't love them, but they're recognizable. Some bumblebees, the big fuzzy bees. Probably the most common in the prairies are our sweat bees up here. Those bright green ones, often people think they look like wasps or even flies. But they're really good at landing on your skin and just licking up sweat. That's where they get their name. And then some kind of mining bees, digger bees, those kinds of things are pretty popular. Right now on the buffalo gourd, if you have seen any of that growing, we've got some very wonderfully adorable squash bees out. So you might have seen those. They're very, very fuzzy and usually covered in pollen. So those are just some. I brought one small box of native bees that are pinned in the back table with the pheasants. So you can kind of see some of what my lab's collected. Forgive that it's a small box. I've only been here one field season. But so why do we care about native bees? Well, they're a lot more diverse than our honeybees. So the size diversity is one thing. So the size of bees affect how far they can fly and how much pollen they can carry. So something like that big carpenter bee can carry a whole lot of pollen and fly maybe a mile, give or take. These really small bees, this is the smallest bee, it's called a perdita bee. And they're actually pretty common here, but given that really small body size, they can't carry a lot of pollen, but they're very important pollinators. The other thing that is different when we think about native bees is how long their tongues are. So their tongues are actually called a proboscis. But we can see a little window into coevolution if we look at the different lengths of the proboscis on native bees. So we have what's called a long-tongued bees, and so that red bar is just trying to point out how long that proboscis is. And so they're specially designed to pollinate some of our flowers with these long corollas, whereas our shorter-tongued bees are great at pollinating asters, which we also love asters, of course. But you can kind of see some of this coevolution. So if we lose our native pollinators, we're going to start kind of risking some of our more specialized wildflowers. The last thing that I want to just highlight a little bit of differentiation about is we're probably all familiar with where honeybees live, the commercial reared honeybees, the ones that beekeepers have usually in these hive boxes. When they're feral or wild, if you will, they make all sorts of beautiful nests, often in trees. But when we're talking about natives, we see all sorts of variety. So about 70% of native bees nest in the ground, which is usually a surprise. So keeping kind of some bare ground around your land is usually beneficial, especially in the prairie. So we have a sweat bee here nesting in the ground. We have a megachilid, or a leafcutter bee, which you've probably seen cutting up rose bushes, maybe with those really nice half circles cut into your plants. They will nest in any kind of stems and trees. Digger bees, mining bees, and then bumblebees, which you can see this one female here. Bumblebees are one of the kind of pseudo-social, they do live in social groups, but the vast majority of native bees live completely alone. So honeybees live in these huge numbers, thousands upon tens of thousands of individuals, whereas native bees are usually living alone. How am I doing? Okay. I'm sorry, I have too much animation. So what I'm really interested in is our native bees, like this big old Bombus pennsylvanicus, which is actually a type of bumblebee that we have here. This is a big female, and I'm pretty sure she's on wild lettuce or something. And how their interactions with native plants, and I forgot to answer, but my very favorite wildflower is Gaillardia Indian blanket. I did an experiment in my PhD, and it's a really sturdy plant. And it actually smells beautiful. If you've ever gotten a chance, give it a sniff. And then my favorite pollinator are actually those sweat bees. They're underappreciated and undervalued, and I just kind of love them. But I'm really interested in this interaction, bees and their flowers, and what humans are doing to the landscape, either farming, ranching, developing land, growing crops, might impact that particular interaction. And I think I will leave it there. I'd love to answer any questions now or at the end.
We'll save it.
Yeah, save it for the end. But thank you.
I was getting ready to call you out because I thought you came back.
I know. Sorry, I meant to start with that.
You came back, good job. You mentioned Indian blanket, and I noticed there was a ton out there at the Cedar Bluff Wildlife Area earlier this summer. So we have Dalton Oliver, and he's going to talk about his work at the wildlife area out at Cedar Bluff and beyond.
Yeah. Mine might not be so scientific. I'm more like dig a fence post, set a fence post, drag a fence kind of guy. So that's me. So. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I am the habitat specialist. I work in a partnership with Wildlife and Parks at Cedar Bluff for Pheasants Forever also. And so we manage Cedar Bluff Wildlife Area, Veterans Wildlife Area south of Goodland, which is a short grass prairie, and Logan Wildlife Area in Logan County by Russell Springs. And so that totals, I don't know, call it 18,000 acres or so. Okay, and so some of the tools of wildlife management that we do, you can find this in the game management book written by Aldo Leopold, and he talks about it some in the Sand County Almanac, where we have axe, cow, plow, and fire. And today we have chemical, and we also, the one that's not always used for everybody is gun. People can harvest and do things like that. So here's an example of axe. So this was clearing an understory. Actually, there's a turkey roost here, and we're clearing cedars from an understory. A lot of this sort of stuff where we're doing timber, this is where we're doing timber stand clearing and things like that. And it's not always clearing. We're trying to get sunlight to the ground to stimulate forgrowth, to stimulate wildflowers. And so, unfortunately, this turned out to be poison ivy. So, so here's another example. This is just a large eastern red cedar. It's primarily little blue stem here in the picture, and there's some yucca and stuff. So this tree is now gone, and so it was bare dirt. And so the topsoil out there is yay deep. The rest is rock in most places. And so this tree, I don't have the attachment on this one, but so a lot of the trees I'm taking out, and there's bare dirt, but there's a seed bank there. So what comes up is usually snow on the mountain or common sunflowers. That's generally what comes up. And then little blue stem can be aggressive, so that'll eventually get there. Here's another example. This is in the North Cabins area. That would be on the east side of the road, or west side of the road, excuse me. And so this was just more cedar clearing. Eventually we'll burn this, and those trees are put in strategic piles for now. Actually, believe it or not, we manage a lot for quail. That's kind of our goal. And so quail are kind of an umbrella species. When you manage for quail, you're managing for flowering plants. They need soft-bodied insects when they're small. So that's what we're managing for. And here's where the poison ivy took over, obviously. And so these are grazing pictures from Norton Wildlife Area. You can see smooth brome. Oh, my bad. Which one was it? Here. So you can see this is smooth brome. This is early intensive grazing. This would be a later summer grazing here. So the early and intensive grazing stimulated some big blue stem growth here. Looks a heck of a lot better than it did in this early springtime. And here's some more flowers. So down here you can see common sunflowers and snow on the mountain. There's mare's tail, of all things in there, but I can't tell if this is goldenrod or what up here. And then we have a lot of success when we graze out south of Goodland. And so very early and intensive grazing, we have some noxious plants, Canada thistle, and the cows actually will eat it when it's real small, and it's knocked it way back. That plus chemical application, we have really basically eliminated it. And this year they've had a ton of rain out there, so the wildlife area the flowers are taller than the ceiling, so it looks awesome. And so a lot of what we do, so that was axe cow, this would be plow. So we've got our contour strip disking. So these are stair-stepped food plots. This strip here that's going right here, simply disked, and it's disked early. So February to March, and that creates early successional growth. So you've got a lot of wildflowers that come up in here. And you don't have the sod bound after you disc it. And you generally find quail and insects and other things in these areas. And this is what it looks like. So where the arrows are pointing to, or where the disc stripped here, there's snow on the mountain, and there's lamb's quarter and all sorts of things in this. And I wish this picture was a little bit better, but that is much taller, and the understory is not quite as thick as it would be what's next to it there in the prairie. And then fire. So We do quite a few fires. Recently we haven't because of the way the weather has been. It's been really dry. You know, we haven't had that much rain. So in other parts of the state, fire is being used every day. So here's our Code 3 March 1st burn. This would have been done in 2021. And this is second year. So this would have been this spring. There's Indian blanket flower here, which also I might add is probably one of my favorites too. These, I don't know if that's violet or blue, but it is spiderwort. That would probably be my favorite. There's a ton of it out there. I think there's lamb's quarter on the bottom. There's some sunflowers that are just peeking through. This picture was taken, I think, in May, so it was pretty early on. And then last one, chemical application. So this was solid smooth brome. You wait until after the first frost of the year. So this was sprayed in October of last year. Spray it with glyphosate Roundup, and then you get this response on the right. A lot of this is witchgrass. I didn't get a picture taken soon enough, so a lot of the early successional growth had already seeded and matured. So you don't see the flowers, but you can see the sunflowers there. There is some snow on the mountain there. And then this would have been a February, an early burn. So in order to create a lot of wildflowers, it's early in the year, so January, February, March. Not always great times to burn and do things like that, so sometimes disking helps. But this was a burn in February that was interseeded. It was primarily little blue stem before, and then interseed, there's some alfalfa and stuff in there in the seed mix. And then here's a pollinator planting. There's yellow prairie coneflower. There's Maximilian sunflowers everywhere. And I think there was also alfalfa in that one too. And now that is mostly switchgrass and big blue stem. And here's some stuff that we also additionally do. These are spring cover crops. It's a brassica mix. It's got turnips and radishes and sunflowers, and these are oats and all sorts of things. And this was this year, so this looks exceptional right now, actually. And this was early on. Here's what it looks like. You can see the oats that are in here. The last thing is don't overlook the benefits of this. And these things are easy to collect for yourself if you want to start your own wildflowers in your yard. So, for example, my supervisor, this is his garden. There's clammy weed. I don't know if there's verbena or what this is here. There's snow on the mountain, sunflowers. He's got all sorts of stuff there. Butterfly, milkweed, everything. And so, and then there's ironweed, which was a pretty one that just recently, that's coming to an end now. And then here's reference tools. So this is my favorite book. I don't know what you guys use in class, but this is what I use by Michael Haddock. It's the best one in my opinion. If you're tech savvy, Seek by iNaturalist is an app you can get on your phone, and it is so cool. You can, seriously anything, it doesn't have to be just a plant, a bug too. It'll get you close. I would recommend looking it up afterwards and finding for sure on Google or whatever else, because it's not always right, but there's our reference tools. And that's all I've got.
Did you share your favorite pollinator?
Oh, my favorite pollinators, I'm pretty simple. So I would say spiderwort because it's visually appealing, and a sphinx moth because it's big and cool. Yeah, it's simple. So.
I don't have a presentation either. Again, my name's Camden Sweet. I work with landowners on a daily basis. My favorite pollinators is going to be monarch butterflies and other butterflies. I can still remember growing them in class when I was in elementary school. And so then I've always had an appreciation. And then my grandparents have some ground out in western Kansas, in Wichita County, Scott County. And so then seeing this milkweed and stuff out there, those kind of became my favorites. And so that's kind of mine. I'm going to have two parts. I'm going to talk about my work with landowners, but then also our Pheasants Forever mission and why Pheasants Forever talks about pollinators. Kind of my opinion on why we do it. It's very easy to walk into a school and talk about pollinators to any kid. You know, you've got wildflowers that are going to be very bright, colorful. They're going to attract the butterflies and things like that. So it's easy to get that next generation interested in wildlife, interested in being outdoors. A lot of our farm biologists and habitat specialists across the U.S. go into schools and start wildlife pollinator plantings with the kids on ground and things like that. So it's very easy to get that next generation up and ready and interested into it. What Brandon's bringing up here is more of the landowner side of everything. So that pheasant bundle that he clicked on, this is publication by the Kansas Forest Service. It describes 4 different types of shrubs for sandhill plum, fragrant sumac, golden currant, and chokecherry. That's kind of their 4 that they recommend. And then there on that second page that he scrolled down to, it describes how to plant them. He writes the amount of spacing they want in there, kind of how far apart, and things like that. The quail bundle is essentially the same thing. They just switch out American plum for sandhill plum on the quail bundle and bring the spacing from 6 foot on the pheasant down to 4 foot on the quail. Obviously a smaller bird, they don't need as much room to run around. And then this next one he's pulling up, this was our Working Lands for Wildlife initiative that NRCS and Pheasants Forever collaborated on this last year. It's been around for a lot longer, but this bobwhite one was specifically corroborated this last year to really bring that attention to the grasslands. They're realizing that we have a major issue with the Great Plains. They've started several initiatives in this last year or so, really focusing on this Great Plains grassland. The bobwhite one, we're doing research actually on it up in my area. They had 4 focal areas across Kansas. Osborne over to Graham and Norton to Smith. That was our main focal area in this part of the state. I contacted some landowners that had done NRCS management practices out there. Specifically brush management was kind of our main one that we were looking at. To see, they wanted to get the research to see how that was affecting the quail populations in the area. This is all put on actually by the University of Georgia. It started down there because they've turned a lot of those old plantations into quail plantations. And so they were discussing kind of the habitat down there and those things like that. They flew 4 of us from Kansas down to Georgia last summer and gave us a kind of a week-long crash course on bobwhites and the habitat down there and the things they do with this program. But then they asked us to come back and kind of run it on our own. So they teamed up this last year with NRCS and created a separate fund inside of what NRCS calls EQIP, which is its Environmental Qualities Incentives Program. It's just a way for anybody to come in the door and get help to work on conservation. It's a cost share system, but they set up their own separate pool here in Kansas for the first time for just quail specifically. They didn't put very much money into it because they really weren't sure what was going to be happening and how much interest. We maxed out their money in about 3 days. We're hoping with the amount of interest that we've demonstrated and the amount of contracts that are sitting there waiting for them, they're going to give us quite a bit more money next year to see a lot more change on the ground and habitat on the ground. But this whole presser that he put up there, that was just them allowing the general public kind of an easier way to walk in and pick something up and read about quail, read about the background, read about the management practices, and not have to walk into an NRCS office and get all of their typical mumbo jumbo that they kind of try to feed. So again, there's the quail bundle, down to 40 feet for a whole block and 4 feet of spacing. And then that last one in there, in his little thing that he'll pull up, is some new research on controlling Phragmites. Obviously, it's popping up more and more. A lot of people are fighting it on the landscape. And this is kind of what we've heard as the top stuff right now. I know I put one out in my home office there of Osborne, and it's usually on the desk for about a day until somebody comes and picks it up, and we have to put a new one right back out for the next landowner. So it's a lot of information in this. It goes through all of the biology, it shows all the root systems, all that things like that. You get later on in it, it talks about the management strategies, it talks about the specific chemicals, when you can kind of use them, Up there, it's a little hard to see, obviously, but rodeo, habitat, glyphosate, imazapyr. Basically, it's just kind of going to be whether it's water soluble or not. That's really the difference in the names up there.
What's the common name for that plant? What do we know it as?
Phragmites.
Really?
Yeah, it is changed to Phragmites.
Never heard of it.
What it used to be?
I've heard some people call it common reed. I've known it as Phragmites since I started working in wildlife the last couple of years, but that's what I've always called it. And there's some pictures on that. I think Brandon might print some of this stuff off for you guys to maybe pick up at the background, but it's fairly, it looks a lot like several of our other native grasses. The only difference is it gets quite a bit taller, and it really loves the low wetland areas. If you got a creek area that kind of dries up for a little bit, you're going to have Phragmites move in and take over. And then it is a pain to get back out of there. A lot of people fight it. Nobody has much success. This is kind of what I've started to see as the main success. Is a lot of chemical application. Again, and that's kind of the other part of my job is just information to the public. I deal with landowners obviously on a daily basis, so a lot of mine is if a landowner comes into one of my 9 counties that I cover, I get called in if they're specifically talking about wildlife. I've kind of set that base with all of the SDCs for NRCS in these areas that, hey, if it's wildlife, I'd like to be involved. And they don't mind that because they have enough other workload that they don't want to really work on wildlife. So it's an easy hole for me to walk into any NRCS office and have a job and pick it up. So a lot of that is just kind of getting the public information on Phragmites, on other issues. A lot of our big one is cedar trees. Pheasants Forever on a stance is against all trees, cedars, locusts, elms, and we like to see it all gone. That's where we use fire, brush management, a lot of those habitat practices to remove them from the prairies because the native prairie is a better habitat than that tree. It just always has been, always will be, and especially in these areas. I mean, historically, this area was dominated by grasslands with no trees. And it was dominated by fire. The Indians figured out pretty quick the animals followed the old fires. And so they knew where to hunt and they knew when to light fires. And it was kind of on a yearly basis or 3 to 4 or 5 year basis that it was always getting lit up historically. Obviously, we've went away from that with cropping practices and other things and just the general fear of fire on the landscape. But when you have a good, solid prescribed burn, as we call them, with the right amount of people and the right planning, you hardly see any issues. There's a lot of information put out by Kansas Natural Fire, Prescribed Fire Council that, in 100% of burns, maybe 95, 96% never get out of their intended area. And that other 3-4%, it might have went across the fence and burned up 5 foot, and then they got it back out. It's less than 1% actually become a true wildfire. A lot of the wildfires you hear about and see about, it's mismanaged lands, a lot of cedar trees being the big one. As that fire gets up in the tops of those trees, it then can carry. And an ember can fly a long ways on a wind. The big one I think about, not only in this area, but a couple of years ago, obviously in December, we had those big wildfires up here. I know people out there in that western Kansas area that lost their lives because of it. And it caught their shelter belts around their homes on fire, and that caught their house on fire. And it burned a lot of ground, which has looked good. I enjoyed driving back through this area afterwards and seeing all that brand new green growth. It was really good to reset some of these areas. And I know it killed a lot of cattle populations, but that really wasn't necessarily a bad thing. If you overmanaged or overgrazed because you didn't have the grass, enough grass for your cows, you no longer had those cows on that area, and that gave that grass an actual year and a half to truly come back and reestablish into those true native shortgrass and mixed grass prairies that we have around here. And so that's a lot of what I do is just a lot of that base habitat and knowledge. You mentioned CRP. I am the main person that runs around in any of the 9 counties and looks at it. If you own CRP or have anything, you've probably seen my name in the last 3 years since I started. I'm kind of the one attached to that, and so I'm the one that gets to check a lot of the issues and see how things are going, which is something that I think had long been since left on the wayside by NRCS. They didn't have time, and so it was a very quick drive-by on the road. And then you put some of us farm bill biologists in the state, which I believe we're fluctuating now. I think we're probably between 12 to 17 of us across the state. And that's our job, is to go out and make sure CRP is being handled correctly anymore. So.
Favorite pollinator and wildflower.
I did that earlier.
Oh, did you? Yeah. Oh, man, I was thinking about something else. I was gonna give you trouble about, cause I know you guys like you say you hate trees, you like totally owned it. You Nathan Langletter.
I'm going to go ahead and stand, if that's all right, and I'll need that pointer eventually. But I'm Nathan Legleiter. I'm a native of Hayes, and as Brandon said in my intro, I'm the acting president for Pheasants Forever here in Hayes, the Smoky Hill chapter, so I'm proud to represent them. A fun fact about me is I am the least educated of this panel when it comes to terms. When it comes to terms of habitat and biology. I do not have a biology background, as Brandon mentioned. And I do not work for habitat companies anywhere here. But that is actually why I am here to speak. I'm just a common person. I've got a passion for habitat. In the last 5 years, I've probably taken that passion too far if you talk to my family and friends. I've got a couple farms that I'm managing and done a lot of habitat. Some of it thanks to guys like Dalton, who also contribute to our Pheasants Forever organization here locally. And they've steered me in the right direction, and obviously lots of mistakes along the way that have really helped me. But real quick, so I also don't forget or anything, my favorite pollinator, I'm going to keep it simple, is the bumblebee. I love the bumblebee. It's colorful. I was dove hunting the other night with my friend and heard the bumblebee buzzing, and so made me think the bumblebee would be that. And then my favorite wildflower is the Maximilian sunflower. For three main reasons. One, it's easy to identify because it's tall and it's plentiful, so you always can find it. Number two, reminds me of my mother. Gotta love your mom. She's a big sunflower supporter. And number three, it reminds me of a friend that's no longer here, Curtis Schmidt. And some of the biology people will remember Curtis, and he was just a good guy. So what am I here to talk about? I had the privilege of implementing a monarch butterfly plot on my personal farm in Ness County. And once again, as I mentioned, the main thing I want you to take away from tonight is that anybody can do this. So that was me. So this is the piece of ground. I didn't touch anything. Okay. This is the piece of ground. You can see it. It's in the northeast quarter of that section. It's a half mile by a half mile. And like most of you look at it and you say, wow, that's a nice piece of ground. It is. It's all farm ground. It's flat. It's well terraced. It's got proper drainage. It's exactly what we wanted from a commercial agricultural standpoint because we hope to get a good return off of that ground. But the habitat man inside of me said, well, that's just not fun. I want some waste ground. I want some thickets. I want something that's producing habitat to better pheasants, and anything that betters pheasants also betters all animals. So I got the brainy idea to implement the monarch butterfly after I started looking at a soils legend. And so if you look at the soils legend, you can see in the northwest corner, there's a couple acres that is highly sloped and less desirable soils. You can see down the middle where the waterway was, that is also heavily sloped, less desirable soils. And in the far southeast corner, that is a low-lying drainage area where a waterway drains into it, and that is less desirable. So I figured, well, how can I implement habitat into those acres and get rid of less productive property? So I started reaching out to my connections. Very good, Brandon. Okay. Started reaching out to some of my connections and working with the NRCS office out in Ness County. Found out that there's a great opportunity for the Monarch Butterfly Initiative. And went for it. And I will mention that this was all started back in 2019. So I'll get into that in just a little bit more detail. So with much planning and a lot of research, you can see here, we took the northwest corner approximately, 2.4 acres roughly. We've mapped that out. We took each side of the waterway. Once again, I don't remember the acres. They're up there, 7, 8 acres on each side. Mapped those out and then took the far southeast corner, approximately 2 acres again, and mapped that out. And so we targeted those acres to be implemented into a monarch butterfly program and kind of hit the ground running. And I will mention the total acres on that was 19.5. And so it worked out really well. It gave me an accomplishment of taking out less productive land as well as enhancing the habitat locally. And I'll get into some of that here too in just a second. Okay, so Brandon, if you can zoom in. So this was the seed plan that NRCS required, and it's probably still hard to read. But basically, it consists of grasses and forbs. And so they want to mix, and our biology friends across the room here will know all about this. But you obviously got your 3 grasses up front, your little blue stem, your side oats, and your blue brahma. Those are just the classic grasses of the native prairie. Everyone in this room has seen them, whether you know it or not. And they all did extremely well, establishing within the first year. The second set of them, and even the third, would be your forbs. Of all the grasses and forbs that are up there, we literally had 90% of them come up within the first year. So we had great success, and I'll have pictures here. I'll have pictures here. Am I talking too loud? I'll have pictures here to show you. I can get rid of this, Brandon. Although it was fun hearing myself talk on the mic. Hello? Are we good? Are we good? Yeah. So of all those, we had 90% of them show up, which was extremely successful. So we had biologists, NRCS workers come and look at it over a couple-year period, and it was really, really fun to share. So I'm just going to kind of go through now some slides. A couple of them are repetitive. But this was, so what we did, I guess I'll back up. What we did is the property was currently planted into winter wheat, which actually worked out to be great because it was a clean landscape. It had something in there to hold the soil, such as a cover crop, as you'll hear a lot of people say. And one big advantage was this property was mitigated of weeds. It was a very clean property. It was, I'm done with that. It was, yeah, everybody can hear me. Yeah. So it was designed with just a clean slate. It mitigated a lot of problems. And then obviously, like all PF leaders, you got to put your brand up there. So we did some advertising. These are just some other pictures. This would have been that northwest quarter. It has heavy slope. Obviously, you can see it just from kind of a ground level aspect. We had just sprayed this weed about a week prior with Roundup because we were preparing to seed it. So you can see it there. It's just slowly starting to die. Just another reference. This would have been the west side of that waterway. Obviously, the wheat is starting to die there. And then just a matter of a few days later, we had a guy come in and seed in all of the pollinator. And that was quite the process, very interesting. There is some expense with doing that, contrary to Dalton's approach, which is a great approach, which is more of a native approach. This one here, unfortunately, was a more costly approach. But fortunately, we had great success. So I thought that was kind of a neat picture. So then here, this would be September of 2020. So this would be our first fiscal growing year. You can see here we had just an abundant amount of Kansas common sunflower or Kansas sunflower. We had a number of other forbs in there, which I'll show you pictures of. But I will tell you, when I first pulled up to this, I was just in awe. I mean, you could literally hear the bees buzzing from the roadside. I'm not joking. There were so many insects in there. It was just one of the most rewarding moments of my life. And so that's just kind of an overview picture. This would have been in the southeast corner, the one that was lower lying and held water occasionally. You can see there, it's just very, very dense and a lot of sunflower. By then, we already had our Maximilian coming in, and then a dozen other forbs, which I'll show you pictures on as well. Who doesn't love that picture, right? Yeah, so that's just awesome right there. There's your annual sunflower, your Kansas sunflower, I call it. Those things were just scattered everywhere densely. and just bugs and bees crawling all over them. It was really a neat process. Here's your butterfly milkweed. That was right before the bloom stage. I'll have a few pictures here in just a minute. That was just early on. I think that was the very first wildflower that I seen, so I took a picture right away. Little to my knowledge, I would be seeing hundreds, if not thousands more throughout the field pretty soon. There's just another one of the annual sunflower. You can see in the background, just jillions of annual sunflower. And like all these guys know up here, annual sunflower is very easy to get introduced back into the landscape because there's just a network of seeds sitting there, or a bank of seeds sitting there for years and years. And then, as I mentioned, my Maximilian sunflower. This picture was just taken the other day. I was just out there, and it is all over. And like all things, it comes and goes on certain years depending on drought and moisture and all that good stuff. Last one, or one of the last ones here, will be the Indian blanket. So everyone mentioned Indian blanket. We had a couple of them up here that those were their favorite. Those are just beautiful. Your black-eyed Susans, another really, really colorful. And you got to remember, these are out in the middle of nowhere. These aren't in your backyard. So really rewarding. Your dotted gay feather on there. And I actually had to look this one up. Brandon, help me out. Yeah, pitcher sage. I didn't know what it was, and it's not even in the seed mix. So it's all over out there. So that just goes to show you what kind of a seed bank is out in these native areas. Even if they were in production agriculture for 100 years, this plant came up and it's bountiful out there. And that picture was taken just the other day. Butterfly milkweed, obviously a number of them. And then, help me out again, the upright prairie cone. Unfortunately, I caught it right after the leaves had fallen. So it went there. And then the butterfly milkweed. And then that was, social media, you got to put that on there. So we have wildflowers and the butterfly plots. Where am I out of time? Am I pretty well done?
You're worried about the biologists.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's kind of my story. The takeaway of tonight I want from me at least is that don't be afraid to do it. As your biologist and your habitat friends say, seeds don't grow in a jar. So you need to get your seeds out in the soil. You'll learn the hard way, but always try again. So that's me. Thanks.
Go ahead. So without owning ground, what can a person do to support pollinators and wildflowers in our area?
Well, one thing would be to partner up with your local Pheasants Forever organization. We've got the resources to connect. We've done a project out at Cedar Bluff. It's been 7-8 years ago. We impacted a few acres out there. And so I would just strongly encourage you to look at us for a resource.
And I've got a picture over there of a duck stand. And duck's a little different than upland, but whenever you buy a duck stand, well, the artwork on it is wonderful. There's a whole competition with it. But I think 98% of the funds for duck stand go back to purchasing ground, land, and then also for preservation. And that benefits way more than just birds, ducks, and migratory birds. It benefits box turtles, salamanders, whatever it might be. So even if you're not a hunter, like buying a duck stand really makes a difference. Any closing thoughts from anybody?
I'll continue on. You're not a landowner, but you want to come out and help. Easiest way is spread more education. Take something back. Take any of this stuff back. Specifically in the state of Kansas, any license you purchase, anything you do, whether you actually use that license or not, comes back to funding Dalton's job specifically with wildlife and parks and everything that they do on the landscape. And they have their own private lands biologists, just like myself, that's working with their landowners, and they have their own habitat program that they also cost share with. So there's other ways than just you on your own land. Any of that donation that goes back into the state can be used back right on the ground.
Nathan, the last figure you said you were so pleased with your germination rate, but you hear stories of people putting thousands of dollars and millions of seeds in the ground and then you're really disappointed. Did you have really good rain that spring, or?
Yeah, well, two comments on that. One is don't give up and don't expect a good germination rate. Sometimes within the first 2 to 3 years,
if you're lucky. And number two, yes, we obviously, the date on there was 2019. So if you think back, that 2019 and even 2020 year was heavy rainfall and ultimately worked out well.
Can I say yes? Okay. When we had those back-to-back blizzards in 1987, I was living on a farm out in Trigo County, and my husband owned a lot of ranch land. And that summer, we would go out, he would check the cattle. I was watching at the flowers. There were flowers that came up that you never saw, but in a wet year. And having had that moisture that winter just brought them all up out of the ground. Those seeds are in the ground and all they need is just the right conditions and they're gonna come back. In fact, that prompted me to buy my first book on wildflowers in Kansas.
Mr. Stramel, I remember you, I had you in class. Another thing is like when you plant those new plantings, depending on what your goals are and stuff, I know they're having a lot of success at Glen Alders Wildlife Area, where they planted, say March 15th to May 15th, they're planting their seed mix. It's a big four. It's Indian grass, big blue, little blue, and switchgrass are the main grass components. And then there's black-eyed Susans amongst other forbs and stuff. But what they're doing is it'll germinate and it'll come up. Of course, they get more rain there. It'll come up, but then say the weeds or the plants that they don't want are out competing them, so they'll mow it. And when they mow it, then it gives us the stuff that they've planted a chance to grow, and they're having excellent success. It's very impressive.
So we have all you biologists, and no one has yet said sleep, creep, leap?
No.
That's the standard. First year that you don't expect much, it's going to sleep. The second year, you'll see a little bit more, it's going to creep. And the third year, it explodes.
Yeah. Hopefully, you get some rain. It's been pretty dry.
Well, I want to thank all of our biologists and then Nathan for sharing his experience. We have some things that we'd like for all of you to take. Jensen Farms provided us some honey, and so you can get some local honey right over there. Pheasants Forever has some seed packets, some kits that are, I think they're seeds, but they're kind of geared towards kids and getting them to grow some things in your own backyard. Dr. Elze has some of the native bees over there, and then Dr. Galliard has some samples of plants and flowers that were collected right in this area. So please engage with those, and I think these guys will probably stick around a little bit. We're going to ask specific questions, but thanks to Pheasants Forever for getting the word out on all this as well.